Welcome to the last lecture on Hamlet. I'm going to be discussing Act 5 of the play. And again, we will circle back to many of the themes that we've discussed thus far. Act 5 begins in the graveyard, right? And we are about to be privy to the scene of the burial of Ophelia. And before Ophelia's funeral procession comes, Hamlet and Horatio are talking, and of course, they see the grave diggers there, and the grave digger is sort of, taking his job very, very lightly, and Hamlet wonders how somebody who has such a serious profession could be so lighthearted in burying people, there's a moment of comedy. We might even call it comic relief. And Hamlet asks about one particular skull, and he learns from the gravedigger that the skull of one particular person in the graveyard is a friend of his. And so we talked about how many people are familiar to Hamlet in this play. This is a play that's seemingly populated with characters who have something to do with Hamlet's past in one way, shape, or form, whether it's his mother, his uncle, his best friend, in Horatio, his other best friends, supposedly in Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. And here we get yet another familiar to Hamlet, and it is his old playfellow from his youth, Yorick, right? So much of this play has to do with Hamlet's past and a reflection back on his past and people who he thought he knew well. Alas, poor Yorick, when he sees the skull, he remembers the person that once was that skull. Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him, Horatio, a fellow of infinite jest, of most excellent fancy. He hath borne me on his back 1,000 times, and now how abhorred in my imagination it is, my gorge rims at it. The person who used to take little Hamlet for piggyback rides 1,000 times is now this thing that is disgusting, right? It's a skull. It probably smells. It makes Hamlet want to vomit. The very same person who gave Hamlet so much pleasure now makes Hamlet want to throw up. And he looks at the skull and he notes, here hung those lips that I have kissed, I know not how oft. This skull, this place where the mouth is on the skull, there used to be lips here, and how many times I used to kiss the lips that once covered this skull. Where be your jibes now? He's talking to old Yorick, isn't he? Your gambols, your songs, your flashes of merriment that were wont to set the table to roar. This person who used to make everyone laugh, where are his jests now? Right, this person who was once an infinite jest, who's he making laugh now? By the way, if you're a fan of novelist David Foster Wallace, David Foster Wallace wrote a book with exactly this name, Infinite Jest. So he looks at that skull and he says, not one now to mock your own grinning, quite chapfallen. And again, we talked about changes in state, right? And there are so many different changes in state that take place throughout this play. There are changes in political state, right, where old Hamlet assumes control over young Fortinbras's fortune, and then there are also changes in physical state as well, right? And there's plenty of stuff that's talked about as far as physical changes in physical state as well, and we have everything from, that this too solid flesh would melt and resolve itself into a dew. Remember from the to be or not to be speech, right? And they're over and over again, changes in state are referred to over and over again, whether it's changes in political or in physical state. We talked about in the last act, Hamlet telling King Claudius that a king may pass through the guts of a beggar, right? A king may turn to dirt, and a worm may feed on that dirt, and that worm may be caught by a fisherman, and the fisherman can use that worm to catch a fish, and that fish then can be used to and so Hamlet wonders, look at these changes that have taken place, and the change that has taken place has been to another familiar of his. And Horatio asks, Hamlet talks about yet one more change in state. He talks about the great Alexander, right? Alexander the Great, who now has changed states to such an extent that his dust may have become the kind of gum that is now being used to stop a bunghole, right? The great Alexander of the past may be nothing more than something that's being used to stop, a latrine, right? And so these changes in state, there is no, everything has to adapt to a new role, right? Adapting to a new role is part of living in this world. And again, he has these lines. I'm not going to read it, but basically he says, the great Alexander the Great, may have been turned to clay, and that clay may now be used to stop a beer barrel or to plug a hole in the wall. There goes your great Alexander. And then after they finish having this conversation, they hide, don't they? They hide as the funeral procession arrives, and we can consider this hiding and watching the funeral procession to be yet another play within a play, right? We've seen a couple of them already, and Hamlet and Horatio watching the funeral procession arrive may be yet another instance of this. Gertrude, it's here that Hamlet discovers that the person who's arriving is the person who is to be buried is his Ophelia. He doesn't realize that Ophelia is dead. He doesn't realize that she's committed suicide until this moment. And Gertrude says, speaking to the body that once was Ophelia, I hoped thou shouldst have been my Hamlet's wife. I thought thy bride bed to have decked, sweet maid, and not have strewed thy grave. And so again, talk about things that are repurposed, right? Gertrude is laying a funeral wreath on Ophelia's bed. She's got flowers prepared to deck her grave. And those are the same flowers that she had hoped instead would be used in a celebratory occasion, the occasion of marriage. And so this should remind you of something from earlier in the play. Had there been any moments earlier in the play when a funeral was unexpectedly joined together with a wedding? Things can often turn into their opposites, and I put that word in quotes here. The flowers that Gertrude had expected to deck Ophelia's marriage with instead become flowers at the funeral. Everything changes. And Laertes, of course, mourns the loss of his sister. O treble woe fall 10 times treble on that cursed head, whose wicked deed thy most ingenious sense deprived thee of. And again, he's talking of Hamlet, isn't he, right? It's Hamlet who caused you to lose your mind and commit suicide. And then Laertes jumps into the grave. And when he does this, we have to ask ourselves, what is the effect of hearing this speech on Hamlet, right? Does Hamlet feel guilt at being spoken of in this way? And we know that he might feel guilt because as soon as Laertes says these lines, Hamlet advances, doesn't he, right? He jumps out of hiding and he says to Laertes, what is he whose grief bears such an emphasis, whose phrase of sorrow conjures the wandering stars and makes them stand like wonder-wounded hearers? This is I, Hamlet the Dane. Something in what Laertes says causes Hamlet to break the fourth wall, right? If there is a fourth wall, right, that separates actors from the audience, right, then Hamlet, as an audience member, breaks that fourth wall when Laertes speaks these lines. And so a couple of things that you may want to take note of as an audience member, these lines may have triggered in Hamlet a recollection of the seems speech. Remember, seems, madam, that speech from Act 1 that we discussed before, where Hamlet objects to Gertrude saying, why do you seem to be so sad? And this moment may also have triggered in Hamlet's memory a recollection of his decision to put on that antic disposition. Remember, he plays at being crazy. He plays at being being mad. And seeing what's happened to Ophelia, especially after hearing Laertes' lines, may trigger something in Hamlet. Remember, Hamlet has only pretended to be mad, and as Laertes' lines above indicate, Ophelia actually has gone mad, right? She doesn't seem, right? She doesn't put on an antic disposition. She's actually gone mad. And again, this may be a moment where Hamlet recognizes Ophelia to have been his foil. In how many different cases is Hamlet seeing his own situation and plight in the actions and thoughts of others? In Hamlet's mind, Ophelia has actually outdone his antic disposition performance. She doesn't just seem mad, she's actually gone mad, right? She's outdone him in performance by being the real thing, not just a fictional representation of the real thing. And unlike Hamlet, who only seems to grapple with suicide, Ophelia has actually gone beyond wrestling with the idea of suicide at a philosophical level. She's actually gone through with the deed. Ophelia's madness and suicide are a bracingly real reminder to Hamlet that he has been uncommitted to those ideas that seemed to preoccupy him so much. She has not only acted upon them, but left Hamlet as an audience member, trying to get behind her motivations, feeling guilty that he ever judged her to be a bit player in Polonius's playtext. She's had her own story all along, Hamlet realizes, and now she has brought that story to its own conclusion through her own willful intent, right? She has not just been a supporting player in someone else's story. She has not just been a role player or a character actor. She has had her own story to tell and has brought that story to its own conclusion. And Hamlet starts to realize and see Ophelia as a character with her own agency and independence, and so he feels all the more guilty for having treated her the way that he has. Remember the last time they spoke, it was the nunnery speech, right? And there's a real sense of guilt over here of what kind of an actor Hamlet considered Ophelia to be, and what kind of an actor she turned out to be. She's outacted him, hasn't she, right? And so we think of this whole breaking of the fourth wall as a realization on Hamlet's part that certain people are leads in their own play and not just supporting actors in another play. And he confronts Laertes with these lines. I loved Ophelia. 40,000 brothers could not, with all their quantity of love, make up my sum. What wilt thou do for her? And it's a kind of a challenging question. In other words, he's challenging Laertes through this question, but it's also a kind of absurd challenge, right? How do you challenge how much love, what quantity of love a person bears to another? How exactly do you weigh that? How do you measure that? Hamlet projects all his insecurities about sexual desire onto Laertes. Remember how we talked about the equation, right, of Ophelia's sexuality with that of Gertrude, and again his misplacement of this, and now again his misplacement of his own insecurities onto Laertes, and now his idealization of Ophelia, right? Now that she no longer needs to be treated as a human being, what does he do? He makes an idol out of her. He makes a symbol out of her, right? Something that, as a monument, never needs to change, can always be exactly what he wants it to be for time immemorial. As the gravedigger points out, he's digging a grave for one who used to be a woman but is now a corpse. And so he issues this challenge to Laertes: dost thou come here to whine, to outface me with leaping in her grave? Is that why Laertes is there? To outface him? Again, Hamlet seems to have gone mad in thinking that everything that's happening there, right, is happening with him in mind, which is kind of a crazy thought, right? And he admits, without actually admitting it in his dialogue, that the Danish prince is setting up a ridiculously artificial comparison and competition with Laertes, and even Gertrude notes, after Hamlet has said the above, that Hamlet seems to have gone insane. All of this is the lead into Act 5, Scene 2. It's the scene right after the graveyard scene, and it's the conclusion of the play. The plot that Laertes and Claudius have put into place is going to be discussed in this scene. But before it's discussed, Hamlet explains to Horatio exactly how he was able to escape from Rosencrantz and Guildenstern and his own death in England. Okay, and these lines tell us that Claudius had written a letter asking the King of England to strike off Hamlet's head. And what did Hamlet do with the letter that Claudius wrote? I sat me down, he says at the beginning of Act 5, Scene 2, and devised a new commission and wrote it fair. So what did he do? Hamlet took the play script that Claudius had written and he rewrote it, right? Just because somebody thinks that you must be an actor according to one play script does not mean that you can't rewrite that play script and redirect those actors, and that's exactly what he did, didn't he? Right? Hamlet rewrites the play script and instead writes to the King of England that he should put the bearers to sudden death, not driving time allowed. That play script wherein Claudius had asked for the King of England to put Hamlet to death is rewritten so that the very same King of England is now being asked to put Rosencrantz and Guildenstern to death, right? So Hamlet rewrites their roles also, right? Those two friends of his who had betrayed him now are going to be put to death by Hamlet's rewritten instructions. And Hamlet even reveals to Horatio that he had his father's seal in his purse. And so those two friends of his who had betrayed Hamlet instead get betrayed by Hamlet again, and they basically walk to their own death. And again, this again goes back to this idea of what play script do you operate from, and can it be rewritten for you? Can others rewrite it for you? And this is going to be an important theme as well. The news then comes from Osric that King Claudius has proposed a joust between Laertes and Hamlet, with wages being placed on both sides. And Horatio worries that something's up, something is rotten in the state of Denmark, and he suggests to Hamlet that he not take up the proposed joust. If your mind dislike anything, obey it. I will forestall their repair hither, and say you are not fit. And Hamlet has these important lines, not a whit. We defy augury. There's a special providence in the fall of a sparrow. If it be now, 'tis not to come. If it not be to come, it will be now. If it be not now, yet it will come. The readiness is all. Since no man has aught of what he leaves, what is it to leave betimes? And so Hamlet has again rethought life, and he's rethought this idea of destiny as well, right? In other words, one cannot escape from it, no matter what course of action one chooses. One cannot escape destiny by such action, but that such action is always a part of one's destiny, right? You can never write yourself out of a script for which your life is written, right? Your life is written with a script, and you can never write yourself out of it. You can change roles, you can exchange roles, but you can never write yourself out of a script that has your death written at the end of it. You can never write yourself out of that script. And so when Hamlet and Laertes do come face to face with one another, Hamlet is apologetic. Remember that little chart that I told you to make, or that little chart, that little table where we had characters, murderers, relationship to the murderer? Here at this moment in this dialogue, Hamlet admits to Laertes. He admits that he's changed roles, right? He's changed roles from being the wronged son of a murdered man to being the wrongful murderer of a man whose son he now faces, right? And he has indeed changed roles. And if indeed he's changed roles, and one of the reasons why we might assume that he agrees to face Laertes is that he may realize that justice may come. If justice for a son whose father has wrongly been killed involves him, perhaps it involves him being the one who is killed, so that justice can be fulfilled, rather than a fate in which he does the killing. And he apologizes to Laertes. We kind of see him recognizing himself in a new role. And Laertes says, I'm satisfied in nature, whose motive in this case should stir me to my revenge, but in my terms of honor I stand aloof, and will no reconcilement till by some elder masters of known honor I have a voice of precedent of peace. And at this point, Laertes really has not advanced to the same state that Hamlet is at. He still trusts members of the elder generation, right? Elder generation. With his own welfare. And Hamlet knows better than this. He's already advanced past the stage. Laertes has not. If Laertes is Hamlet's foil, he's a foil who's a little bit behind schedule. Note that Hamlet gives up at this moment. He gives up his antic disposition. He goes even further in asking pardon for that behavior, especially against a young man whose father was unjustly killed and whose grief is apt, genuine, and deserving of redress. Note also that the young man who stands in the same place where Hamlet stood at the beginning of the play is committed to his elder masters. Laertes has reached Hamlet in terms of his anger and grief over an unjustly murdered father. He's reached Hamlet in terms of confronting the murderer who took away his life. He is confronting Hamlet, but Laertes hasn't yet reached Hamlet in his distrust of those elder masters. Laertes thinks that he sees justice in his sights, but if justice for murder can be satisfied by killing the murderer, irrespective of his motives towards repentance, Hamlet knows that one man's justice is another man's penance, right? He doesn't know. Hamlet at this point does not know. He's completely unsure about why he's supposed to be at that duel. Is he supposed to be at that duel so that he can be sorry for what he's done to Laertes, or is he supposed to be at that duel so that he can get justice for the murder of his own father? He's not quite sure. Only being there will reveal that fate and destiny to him. What Claudius could not bring himself to do willingly, in other words, give up the fruits of his sin in repenting for that sin, Hamlet seems too willing to do. He's willing to put himself right in front of Laertes' sword, right, if it means getting actual repentance for the murder that he's committed. Perhaps the best way to commit suicide is to find someone that you've truly wronged and just put yourself in the path of his sword, right? And we don't know what's going to happen. He doesn't know what's going to happen. But again, if you put yourself in the path of his sword and you're killed, then you can get your penance for having killed Laertes' father, and Laertes can get his justice. But again, we've already been told in the previous act that perhaps Laertes' motives, right, for killing Hamlet may also have been sullied, right, by his connection to Claudius, right? So Hamlet, again, gives himself over to fate. Fate will reveal itself to him. Hamlet says to Laertes, I'll be your foil, Laertes. In mine ignorance your skill shall like a star the darkest night stick fiery off. If earlier Hamlet had imagined Laertes as his foil in the role of Claudius, now Hamlet imagined Hamlet himself to be Laertes' foil. Again, Hamlet, puts himself in a supporting role, admitting that it is Laertes who may be the main protagonist of a story in which Hamlet is really destined to just die. He's supposed to be the antagonist, and maybe his fate in that story, in Laertes' story, is just to be the person who's there to receive the blow. As the sword fight takes place, both men are hit, both men are wounded by the same sword, and we know that death becomes imminent for both Laertes and Hamlet. We might think to ourselves, what's the justice in this? Well, perhaps the justice for Laertes is that he should get rightful revenge for his father's murder. Perhaps the justice for Hamlet is that he should be able to do penance, right, for having killed Laertes. And perhaps the justice in Laertes dying is that Laertes should be punished for listening to the advice of an elder generation member who wants nothing more than to pit the members of the younger generation against one another. If you're going to listen to such members of the elder generation, you will die. No less certainly than Ophelia, who has died. And Claudius, meanwhile, the very same Claudius who had been consciously unwilling to give up the fruits of his labor, unconsciously becomes the director of the death of Gertrude, that very Gertrude who he was not willing to give up because she was part of what he earned through killing old Hamlet. He actually becomes the agent. King Claudius becomes the agent of Gertrude's murder. She drinks from the poisoned cup that Claudius poisons himself. He cannot stop Gertrude. She doesn't realize that she is an unconscious actor who is operating off her own script when she picks up that poisoned glass and she drinks it despite Claudius's instructions. Gertrude, do not drink. She operates off her own script, and in doing so, essentially, she kills herself, but Claudius's hand is in that. It is the poisoned cup. It is too late. And Hamlet, who meanwhile is offered that same cup, refuses to drink from that poisoned cup. And so we ask ourselves, why does this all happen? Why does the play end in the way that it does? And the truth comes out with each person's dying breath. They bleed on both sides. How is it, my lord? How is it, Laertes? And Laertes realizes that with his last breath, he should tell Hamlet exactly what has happened. He realizes that there's no point. I have been hoisted my own petard. I'm going to be killed with my own sword. I'm justly killed with mine own treachery. Perhaps he realizes the costs of relying on an elder generation member to wipe out, perhaps he realizes that the cost of relying on an elder generation member is one's own ruination, right? And that's exactly what has happened before. And Hamlet finds out, even from Gertrude, right, who discovers that she's been poisoned. She points this out to him as well. And Gertrude also brings out the truth, right? And she tells Hamlet, the drink, I am poisoned. And at this moment, right, Hamlet is able to catch Laertes right in the moment of sin, right? If he had been waiting to kill Claudius when Claudius was steeped in sin, now is that moment. But the sin that Claudius is now steeped in is the murder of his own wife and the attempted murder of Hamlet and Laertes. And he kills. Hamlet finally carries out that revenge, and he kills Claudius, right? O villainy, ho, let the doors be locked. Treachery, seek it out. It is here, Hamlet, Hamlet, thou art slain. No medicine in the world can do thee good. In thee there is not a half an hour of life. The treacherous instrument in thy hand, unbaited and envenomed the foul practice, hath turned itself on me, and the king's to blame. And here, with finally two members of the younger generation finally working together, coming to an agreement, right? Coming to an understanding, coming to an alliance, right? Finally, when this happens, Claudius can finally be killed. We wonder if maybe the entire theme of younger generation and older generation was supposed to get us to this point where members of the younger generation finally do come to work together against a common ally, which is a member of the older generation who wants to keep them in their place. Everyone else cries treason, treason, but it's too late, isn't it, right? And Hamlet not only stabs him, but he even feeds him that poison potion, and Claudius dies. And with his dying breath, Laertes asks Hamlet for forgiveness, and Hamlet not only agrees to forgive Laertes, but he also says to Horatio, he says goodbye. He asks Laertes for forgiveness. The members of the younger generation who had been pitted against one another finally come to an understanding of their own roles relative to one another. And Hamlet turns to Horatio and he says, Horatio, report me and my cause aright to the unsatisfied. Remember, things seem to have come full circle. If Act 1, Scene 1 of the play begins with Horatio being told a report, if Horatio is the voice of narration in this play, he certainly ends as the voice of Hamlet's narration, right? The play is bracketed from Act 1, Scene 1 to Act 5, Scene 2, with Horatio being the witness to the story of Hamlet's demise. When we talked about protagonists and antagonists, when we talked about plot, the last injunction to Horatio gets us to think about for whom was this story unfolded. And interestingly enough, the person for whom this entire story was written and narrated may have been the very same Horatio whose entrance into the play marks the beginning of the play, Act 1, Scene 1. And of course, Horatio is not the only one for whom this story was unfolded. Hamlet mentions one more person's name. We know that as Hamlet is dying, Fortinbras, who earlier on seemingly was going to attack the Poles, instead comes and we start to realize that perhaps there is one more person for whom this entire story of Acts 1 through 5 was written, and that person might have been Fortinbras. We hear Fortinbras, the very same Fortinbras who apparently was on his way to attack the Poles. Fortinbras's true destination and intention was to once again attack Denmark and get back what was rightfully his. His fortunes are in Denmark. And as all of this is happening, Fortinbras does attack Denmark. Denmark is once again under siege by young Fortinbras, and Hamlet gets the news of this just moments before he dies. Oh, I die, Horatio. The potent poison quite overcrows my spirit. I cannot live to hear the news from England, but I do prophesy the election lights on Fortinbras. He has my dying voice. We talked about Fortinbras earlier as Hamlet's foil. Indeed, these lines seem to support that. Fortinbras does have Hamlet's dying voice, so tell him, with the occurrence more or less, which have solicited, the rest is silence. These are Hamlet's last words. And so, for whom was this story unfolded? perhaps for Horatio, and also perhaps for Fortinbras to hear the news of how Denmark came to be his through an eyewitness to the entire unfolding of the tragedy of Hamlet, and that of course is Horatio. Horatio and Fortinbras become two key figures, and if we are asking ourselves for whom this plot was written, we may have to wonder to ourselves whether or not Hamlet wasn't a subordinated character or a subordinating character who really was playing a role within a larger story that was written for Fortinbras to know and witnessed by Horatio. Maybe that really has been what we have been witnessing all along. If we filter, and then the last thing that I'll say is that if we filter the entirety of the world through our own eyes, through our own experiences, through our own predispositions, our own ignorances and desires, how can we possibly presume that we are the central protagonists in a life where everyone around us is just a bit player? This is one of the larger issues that the play raises, and the reason why I ask this question is because of these lines which come early on in Act 5, Scene 2. Rashly, and praise be rashness for it, let us know our indiscretion sometimes serves us well, when our deep plots do pall, and that should teach us there's a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them how we will. And these lines, again, sort of go back to that same point of we only learn our fate through in retrospect, don't we? Right? We can never anticipate our fate, and we can never even anticipate what role we're playing in our own dramas, much less in the dramas of others. We must acknowledge for a moment that the opposite is true, that we are the bit players, that the drama in which we are actors is not necessarily our own, that it hasn't been written by us, and perhaps not even for us, that we might be supporting players, supporting actors that enable or catalyze the main plots of the people around us, to come to fruition, that we might go from being supporting actors in one person's life story to being the same for another person's story, and so on until the only plot elements that we can say with 100% surety feature us and us alone is the plot element of our deaths. Indeed, nobody can claim that they are the central figures there. And we remember these last lines, and these are the last lines I'll leave you with for Hamlet. I'm very sorry, good Horatio, that to Laertes I forgot myself. For by the image of my cause, I see the portraiture of his. In noting his own situation, in noticing all the things that have been happening to him, in realizing that he's been mistaken in making himself the central figure in his own tragedy, he starts to see Laertes' story for what it is. And in this realization, Hamlet says, I'll court his favors. Hamlet dies at the end. Certainly to that extent, this play is a tragedy, but perhaps, if indeed tragedy is defined by death and comedy by realization, perhaps even in death, a comedic resolution can be reached if death is accompanied by realization. And it seems like in these lines, though Hamlet is soon to die, there is nevertheless this kind of realization in these lines. And the last thing that we see is Horatio speaking to Fortinbras about everything that he's seen, and Fortinbras saying, let us haste to hear it, and call the noblest to audience. For me, with sorrow I embrace my fortune. I have some right to memory in this kingdom, which now to claim my vantage doth invite me. So I will end that. I will end the Hamlet lecture with that. There's a lot to think about. This is one of the most famous plays, if not the most famous play in the English language. It's a long lecture, I realize, that I've delivered, but obviously there's a lot to say about this play. I'll pause here. I hope you enjoyed Hamlet, and I hope that it's given you a lot to think about. This is a play that thousands of people have written millions of pages about in the 400 years since it was first written. These lectures are certainly not the end of the discussion. I hope they are the beginning of your thinking about this play.